Thank you so much for coming to check out another episode of the Stashcast, where we have interesting conversations with interesting people focused around the world of commercial real estate and prop tech. The Stashcast is brought to you by Needle. What if you could use data and analytics to predict which transactions were going to occur before anybody else? You can with Needle. Come check it out at Needle, NEDL.us to learn more. All right. Today, I have the esteemed Bob Bitzenhofer with us today. Bob is the Vice President for Planning and Development at the Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority. And I'm thrilled to have you with us here today, Bob.
Great to be here, Stash.
Awesome. So we were talking a little bit before we started. Maybe you could go over a kind of brief introduction of who you are, how you got to your current position, and then we can go into what makes the Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority different from others.
Sure thing. I started off in Cincinnati, where you're based. It's my hometown. Born and raised there, went to University of Cincinnati for urban planning. Started off, I think I applied for architecture and then switched to urban planning before I started. Fell in love with that. Did a bunch of internships around town, all for city, state, township governments around town. Love the municipal kind of public side of things. And then by the end of my time at Cincinnati, got the feeling that I needed to do something to maybe open a few more doors for myself. And that took me to law school, and that took me up here to Columbus. So did that and graduated in 2010, which was when no one was hiring lawyers anymore after the financial crisis. I think I went to OSU, Moritz College of Law, and I think our kind of traditional job placement at graduation was in the 90s, maybe 90%. In my year, it was in the 20%. So it was a very tough time to graduate. But thankfully, a friend of mine had been named the CFO of HUD in Washington, D.C., and was hiring staff for his office. And right after law school, I left and headed to Washington, D.C. to work for him. Didn't take the bar, never have taken the bar. I have a law degree, but am not a licensed attorney. So went out there to work for him and immediately got thrown into federal budget stuff, everything relating to the fallout from the financial crisis, and a lot of single family housing work. Ended up working on a program specifically for homeowners who had gotten behind in their mortgage and trying to help them out. It was a one page of the gigantic Dodd-Frank bill, and it was $1 billion given to HUD that we had to spend in a year. So that was in about 35 states, I think. So that was quite a trial by fire for how federal regulations get made, federal procurement works, standing up a program and attempting to run it and spend a bunch of money all within a year, which is harder than you think, as it turns out. I did that for a while and then knew I wanted to get back to Ohio eventually, and then took an opportunity to come work here for the HUD field office in Columbus, and worked on a project up in Cleveland with a bunch of other agencies in the White House. And then that program ended maybe like 2014, 2015. And then I started looking for other opportunities, and thankfully ended up here at the Housing Authority. So when I started here, I was working mostly on our Choice Neighborhoods grant. So that was a $30 million grant from HUD to revitalize the former public housing site on the Near East Side here in Columbus. So I was working on the housing piece of that. So that was like my intro to multifamily housing, and have taken off from there ever since.
That's amazing. Your background is very different from a lot of folks that I talk to that get into real estate as a way to maybe escape their W-2. I'm curious, so going back to your initial education, what was it about urban planning? Because I have a degree in psychology, so I didn't have the opportunity to do that, but I've thought about getting my master's in real estate development or something along those lines. What was it about urban planning that you're like, yeah, this is something I really like?
Again, I think I originally applied for the architecture program. So this is within DAP at the University of Cincinnati. And so was leaning that way. Also wanted to be a golf course architect for a while. Design was more of my what was in my head going into school. And then it was fortuitous that the head of the school of planning told me, "Oh, you can do anything with a planning degree. Just come here." And so went into urban planning, and like I said, just fell in love with it. It was a lot of it was like a liberal arts degree, but just focused on kind of cities and in the urban environment and how all those types of things fit in with how we live in cities. So it was a very broad education. People went into urban design from that. They went into more the social side of things. They went into housing, obviously. So it was a very broad range of career paths you could take from that urban planning degree, not just going to work for a city as a city planner or something like that.
And then when you were in law school, was the focus on like contract law and real estate, things like that? Or what was your thought in pursuing that versus an MBA or something?
Yeah, so I took several real estate classes. Most of law school is pretty planned out for you. All, again, very focused on taking and passing the bar. I went a different way than most folks, but where I could pick electives, I tried to pick more real estate or transactional type electives, not really with a direct kind of future in mind, but just, hey, I've done this. This is what I've been interested in. Let's keep trying to take a few classes like this when I could. I also interned for the State Department of Development while I was in law school, their kind of housing community development branch. So it kept that kind of experience going through that internship.
Hmm, it's amazing. It's fascinating. It's awesome. Okay, you finished law school and you went to HUD. How was that experience going to work for the federal government? Because my experience with HUD is that it's HUD loans basically for multifamily projects, and they have their positives of very long amortization and below market interest rates, but it comes with all these strings attached and takes forever, and you have annual audits and things like that.
Yep.
Uh, how was your experience there?
So my experience was first and foremost formed by my boss, who was to this day, I have to say, still my favorite boss. I love everyone here at the housing authority. My boss is here at the housing authority, so no offense to them, but just as a 26-year-old, kind of not knowing, having a clue what he was doing, my first boss there, the CFO, was fantastic. And so he said, "I trust you," and threw me right into the deep end with whatever projects he would throw at me. So it was very much I feel like that's where I very much got the sense of fake it till you make it part of your work life. Just give it your best, and it's probably going to be pretty good. And you got a lot of other folks around you. So he just threw me into some stuff I had no idea what I was doing with, and found a way to get through it. And whatever small, big, whatever projects they were, just tried to give it my best shot, and it seemed to be okay. And then just spent a lot of time with him talking about everything related to HUD. He'd had a long career in the federal government, so he'd worked for the Small Business Administration, for OMB, so he had been around, and then worked for a lot of folks on the private side that interacted with the government. So we would talk all types of stuff about government finance and government structure and all that. I always used to say that HUD is basically an insurance company with a few other things that we do, because every year FHA gets something like 300 billion, 3 or 400 billion of authority to insure loans, and then the rest of HUD is a 50, 60, 70 billion of spending. So there's a few trillion dollars outstanding of FHA insurance and Ginnie Mae MBS out there, and then then it makes all the rest of the programs look like a drop in the bucket compared to those two massive programs. They had their own accounting and finance shops, that everything flowed through the CFO's office, and we were in all the budget meetings and everything, hearing how they think about risk and how much they're charging for the premium, and how much that's making the government versus how much they're paying out.
Mm.
It's probably very much similar to how a private entity works, obviously a little different with all the kind of goofy rules that they got to follow, but at the end of the day, it was, you're charging a premium, you're making money off that, you're making more than you're losing each year, and what do you do with those reserves? They have a weird rule that they can't stay, gosh, I forget it now, something below 2%. They have to have at least 2% of their outstanding, FHA has to have 2% of their outstanding insurance as reserves. And if you fall below that, you have to get an appropriation from Congress. So that happened once. It was a big deal. But yeah, so we talked a lot about that. And then, so HUD does insurance, and then HUD does rental support. That's when I was there, it was 2/3 of the budget. Now it's almost 90% of the spending is Section 8 or the project-based rental assistance program or public housing. It does a lot of things, but it has five programs that are 99% of what they do.
I think that's amazing that you had a boss when you first started who, trusted you and then also showed you the ropes of, hey,
Yep.
here's how it works. Because I think a lot of people don't necessarily, my whole life, I've just had to figure it out. But so is FHA a subdivision of housing and urban development?
Yep. It was, if I have my history, it began long before HUD became a federal agency. And so I think that's why it's probably thought of as its own thing. But the Assistant Secretary for Housing at HUD is also the FHA commissioner. So at some point they merged them together and put
Hmm.
FHA under HUD.
Interesting. Wow. Fascinating. So many things. Okay. So then you spent some time there. You went back to Columbus, but you're in the HUD office in the field, and then you found your way to the Columbus Housing Authority. So what are you doing there? What's the Columbus CMHA up to these days?
So first of all, we're celebrating our 90th anniversary. It's a big year for us. So we were started,
Congratulations.
yeah, thank you. Started during the Great Depression, and then had our first public housing property. Poindexter Village was built in the late 1930s and opened in 1940 by Franklin Roosevelt. So quite the long history for the Housing Authority, and we're very excited to be celebrating our 90th year this year and have a bunch of stuff going on to celebrate it. So the Housing Authority in general, our mission is to provide access to housing opportunities for our residents, and then also provide them needed social services. And to do that as much as we can through collaborative and innovative partnerships with whoever we can find. For me, in the planning and development office, that means building or buying or renovating as much housing as we can every year. We have a goal of 500 units a year to either acquire or build. So new units added to our portfolio every year. And we do a pretty good job of hitting that target. I think hopefully this year, as of right now, this year, we're at about in the mid 400s targeted to get, but new opportunities are popping up all the time.
Every day.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that kind of 500 unit overarching goal is what I think about all the time. But then you have to operationalize that. And that turns into a kind of diversified strategy to make sure that we are having different types of housing. Old model of housing authorities and public housing and all that was compounds of poverty. So 100% of the property was deeply subsidized, and it was in a probably more traditional inner city neighborhood, oftentimes a minority neighborhood, and that ended up never helping the residents, never helping the neighborhood. You end up in cycles and generations of poverty, and people never get their way out of the properties or the neighborhoods. And so that's we're trying to move beyond that in every deal that we do. So we're looking at mixed income properties. We're looking at properties that serve maybe a particular group of folks that are hard to serve: seniors, veterans, folks with disabilities, stuff like that. So those may be more subsidized, but they're more unique population, not just a giant 400 unit family property or something like that. So diversifying the types of folks we serve and the opportunities in those properties, but then also diversifying the geography we serve. So when I started, and even before that, we were probably 90% of our units were within the city of Columbus and within I-270, which is our outer belt here, and 90% of the families were Columbus Public School families. And now, so they didn't have a choice to do anything else. So if you're living with us, your choices were like three neighborhoods, and you had to go to Columbus Public Schools. And now, as we're 10 years into our strategy, we have just as many units outside of the 270 loop and closing in on a equal balance between Columbus Public Schools and all the other school districts in the county. So much more diversified opportunities for our residents. If they want to live close to downtown and send their kids to Columbus Public Schools, they have plenty of opportunities to do that. If they want to live a little further out, they got a job at an Amazon fulfillment center and they want to be near there and be in that school district, we have opportunities for them out there. So each decision we make on a new property is put through that lens of how is this continuing that diversification of types of units we're doing and geography of those units.
This is one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on as a guest and have a conversation because from my experience, calling on a housing authority is a dead end. Don't want to talk. They don't want to engage. I can't even have lunch with some of these folks because they're like, no, it's against the guidelines. And just trying to get to know you as a person. Like, I'm not even trying to sell you anything or sell
Yeah,
anything from you. And it's just been very difficult to get traction. So it seems like Columbus has taken a very conscious and very different approach. How have you done that? And you touched on why, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit more. You said
sure.
that it was just a couple of neighborhoods and it had to be within the city of Columbus, but now you're expanded outside of the loop.
So this all started long before I got here, and even so, probably at this point, I guess 25, 30 years ago, something like that, our previous administration, the Housing Authority, started to convert our public housing to what's called project-based vouchers. So the Section 8 program, but located at a property, because the public housing program was just failing us. Not to talk bad about my former employer at HUD, but the public housing program was failing us, and we needed to try and figure out some way to sustain ourselves as a housing authority and as a business. So we converted out of the public housing program. We used to be 6 or 7 thousand public housing units and 6 or 7 thousand vouchers, and now we're 14 something thousand vouchers and 200 public housing units. And we'll hopefully be out of the public housing program by the end of this year, out of that kind of subsidy. And so that from that previous administration through to ours started to put us on a better financial footing, but that kind of those legacy properties were still weighing us down. And so I think around 2013, so 10 or 11 years ago, we were staring at a large hole in our finances and a lot of like a financial cliff approaching. And instead of, we could have taken one path, I'm sure our CEO could have at the time, that was more kind of manage the decline and just expect the federal government to save us. And he took the other way of saying, no, we're gonna grow our way out of this. We're gonna create revenue. We're going to be more self-sustainable, and we're going to take this as an opportunity to become bigger than we've ever been. And coming off of that direction led us to the Choice Neighborhoods Grant, which kind of catalyzed our ability to do new construction and that type of work. We then were sitting on a senior property in the middle of the short north, which is our, especially at the time, was definitely the trendy arts and entertainment district. It had been a senior property since before the district even had its first art gallery, when it was still a pretty tough neighborhood. And we had fielded offers for a long time from people trying to turn it into a market rate residential property. And our board and leadership team never were interested in selling it for what those folks were offering. And then a developer came to us and wanted to turn it into a hotel and offered us about, I think, 5 or 6 times more than those residential folks were offering us. And at that point, you're talking about a transformational opportunity that our board and leadership team couldn't turn down. Those two things happening within a couple of years really set us off on that path of, now we have the financial strength to be able to go out and acquire properties just like a normal for-profit developer would. And we have the reserves to be able to put in the time to do new construction projects and not have to worry about how we're going to make payroll, or if we got to go out and get a pre-development loan or something like that to get us by while we try and figure this out, that we had a lot more freedom that way. And so those were a couple pieces of the catalyst to get us going. And those happened right around the time that I was starting as well. So I got to see those things happen, and then in my role, run with them and do as much as we can after those events. So those are the more mechanics of how we got started, but at the core of it has always been our residents and trying to do everything we can to provide them with quality, affordable places to live and access to as many opportunities as we can and treat them like any other market rate developer would treat residents that they're trying to get to live in their communities. We're just because our residents subsidies often attached to our residents doesn't mean they should be treated any differently than anyone else. We're trying to do all we could to provide those, quality, affordable places for them, but then also provide as many more quality, affordable places as we could. That's been our path. And we've since 13, I think we had 1,900 units in our portfolio. And now, as of today, we have almost 5,500 units in our portfolio.
Wow. So the previous model and what maybe many authorities out there do, is it the HAP contracts? Does that stand for Housing Assistance Program? Yeah.
Housing assistance payment, yeah. So
Payment.
that's the Section 8 voucher program. So anytime you're working with a landlord, you're entering into a HAP contract with them. The public housing is something else.
Okay.
It's a contract directly with HUD to provide subsidy to us for those public housing units.
And that says as long as you maintain this occupancy or whatever your occupancy is, we're going to give you the prorated amount of revenue to be able to sustain the property. But to your point, it's just get by or manage the decline. Whereas, you said it without saying it, and I've heard it from my clients and seen them do it. You offer a clean, safe place for people to live, and you respond to their maintenance requests, and you'll always have tenants. And it sounds like you guys are practicing that same philosophy, which is amazing.
Yep.
And maybe I'll ask you to speculate a little bit. Why have other agencies not followed this same pattern or this same mindset or business model?
So that's a good question. As a maybe like a for perspective, there's 3,500 housing authorities across the country, and maybe 3,000 of them have fewer than 500 units and probably fewer than 10 employees. They're their kind of own set of housing authorities that have different challenges and different opportunities than us. But then there are the ones that are roughly our size that a lot of them may be doing similar things that we're doing, maybe a little different than us, but trying to be that more active player in real estate in their communities, and then some that aren't, and then some that are in between. One thing that we always say is that we're governed by state law. State law creates housing authorities, and then HUD just sends them money to then pass through to residents. So we're bound by state law just as much or more than we are by HUD law or federal law. And there's no state law that's specific to CMHA, to Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority. We're playing by the same rules that everyone else can play by. I think we're just trying to maximize all of those abilities that state legislature has given us. Why others don't, housing authorities have been around for a long time. And if you're in a city that has a certain, I don't know, political dynamic or something like that, or you get the wrong set of board members that are just like, nah, this is what you do,
If it ain't broke,
then
don't fix it.
or don't even bother trying. Don't try
Yeah.
something new. Just keep doing this. And so thankfully I think we had we have a visionary CEO and a very supportive and active board that said, yeah, we're in, go do this. And they've been incredibly supportive through all these decisions. So I think there is again, we have the same playbook as everyone else has. I think we had just the right mix of CEO, board, background political situation here in Columbus. People talk about the Columbus way all the time. That was all, I think, in the kind of thrown together in the pot for how we were able to do what we were able to do.
So have you seen some instances where, and maybe it's too premature yet, but breaking that cycle where some of your residents maybe had they been in the previous, oh, don't go over, or over there is public housing, and it just perpetuates I don't know the right word for it, the cycle, we'll say.
Yep.
Have you witnessed or seen some instances where you've provided the opportunity for folks to maybe live closer to their jobs or maybe grant access to school districts or systems that they otherwise wouldn't necessarily have had access to, and then they've gone on to either themselves or their children maybe have
Hmm.
thrived out of that.
Yeah, one story jumps to mind that almost sounds like too perfect to be true, but it happened and we confirmed all the details, so it was real. But I was at a community meeting talking about a project we were working on for in downtown Columbus, and a guy came up to me afterwards. I think he made a comment during the meeting about he's seen how good of work CMHA does or something like that. And it was a very nice comment. But he came up to me afterwards and said he knew a person who was homeless and got a spot in our Columbus Scholar House, which is housing for folks, single parents who are looking to go to college or something like that. So she was able to move from a homeless situation or a very destabilized situation into Columbus Scholar House, and then from there moved into our Legacy Point project, and then was buying her first home. And it turns out it was his fiance, so he knew her very well. And they're buying the home together, but it was just such a perfect encapsulation of getting folks into who are struggling in the most dire situation, then getting that kind of stabilized floor of housing in a place like Scholar House. There's a ton of services wrapped up into it and a very close work between those service providers and the residents on what they need, and there's childcare available and all that, and you can get your feet under you, and then you're able to move to maybe a more affordable unit in another property that's maybe not subsidized but still affordable. And then after that, you're able to buy a home. And that, like I said, I couldn't believe it when I heard it, that it was almost too perfect an encapsulation of our kind of theory of what we're doing here.
Yeah.
So I've heard that. And then, gosh, again, anecdotally, just from around the office, hearing about other residents all the time who have moved from one property to the other, from having a voucher to a market rate unit with us. Those are fairly prevalent.
That's awesome. What are some of the services you mentioned that CMHA provides in those instances? And then maybe a follow-up is, what do you think the role, if any, of the private sector is in maybe helping provide some of those additional services if it's necessary or needed? And is it
Yeah,
necessary or needed?
yeah, absolutely. I guess this might take a while, but so we have a few properties that are what's called permanent supportive housing or service enriched housing. Those are specifically geared towards certain types of folks. So maybe someone with a disability or addiction problems or serious health problems like that. Other ones might be, again, for veterans or seniors. The Columbus Scholar House is an example where it's specifically for a certain single parent type household. And then we're just about fully leased up on a property called Harriet's Hope, which is for survivors of human trafficking and other, folks in that type of situation. So in those properties specifically, those have kind of one general idea in mind. So your services are focused around that one idea. So Scholar House, it might be childcare and early education type work, or and then helping those parents get through whatever school level of school they're trying to get through. And then our Franklin Station property has a clinic on site, so that folks there are, a lot of them are suffering from addiction complications. And so there's a medical center right there on site. There's a food pantry on site as well. So those are at that level around them. And then obviously with survivors of human trafficking, you're dealing with such a precarious situation over in that scenario where folks have just get their life reset in a way. So those properties have a lot of specific services to them. But then after that, our all of our services are coordinated through our Rise Center. It's a nonprofit that we've spun off, and they try to meet all of our other residents where they are. So if we're not providing services ourselves, but if someone needs career counseling or some sort of financial literacy, we can connect them with our network of folks that we've developed over time. And a lot of those are nonprofits, but a lot of those are also for-profit folks. So a lot of banks or other financial institutions are interested in that financial literacy, and we've plugged in with them. Healthcare providers are always looking for ways to do more front end medical services instead of getting everyone through the emergency room or whatever.
Prevention. Yeah.
Yeah. There's definitely a place for the private sector. A lot of the folks who work with their nonprofits, but yeah, there's no way we could do any of that on our own. Our job is to be experts in the kind of understanding the network and kind of constellation of services that are out there, and then bringing them to each of our residents depending on what it is they need.
Hmm. We sold a property a couple of times up there, fairly large asset, and it was full of, I think, refugees, I want to say
Mm.
from Nepal. And the owner at the time was like, these people don't know how to live in apartments. They leave the faucets running and just many other, I wouldn't say horror stories, but just examples of lack of experience in the American society. Are you guys able to, through those partner agencies, or are those services through the partner agencies something that an owner of a property could maybe tap into if they felt it was appropriate?
I don't want to speak for the person who runs our Rise Center, but I think we're always looking to expand what we're able to do. And again, if you have those services are available to anyone who lives in a CMHA property or who has a voucher. And so there may be voucher holders at some of those properties. But yeah, if you accidentally buy a property and don't know that there's a heavy immigrant population in it, then you are probably not setting yourself or your residents up for success. They are Thankfully, Columbus has a fairly long history of bringing immigrant populations in here and welcoming them here. And so there are a lot of service providers and property management people who have learned how to communicate more effectively with those folks on what to do, and understanding their culture and kind of figuring out how to merge their culture with how a building operates, and not creating massive maintenance issues or whatever. But it's not for the faint of heart, because a lot of people's cultures are just very different than ours. And as much as we want to be welcoming, we got to figure out how to communicate well enough with them so that we're all staying on the same page of expectations and understandings in those units.
Hmm. Do you think that's one of the reasons that Columbus has seen such great growth is the wealth? Because I don't think in Cincinnati there's some pockets of non-native Americans here, meaning black and white people, but there's some Africans over in a certain part of town. They tend to group together. Do you think
Hmm.
that that has helped Columbus? And it's because Columbus, you drive around, it's a very diverse place, even though it's in the middle of the Midwest. It's in literally the middle of Ohio.
Yep.
You think that has helped with some of its growth trajectory?
Yeah, I'm sure it's helped. Columbus has a few other factors that I think have helped create a floor for our growth. We're always going to be growing with state government located here, a giant university, and then I don't know how we ended up getting Honda in Marysville, but Honda's here, and then a couple Fortune 500 companies that are already always going to provide that kind of ground floor of growth. Being known as a place to welcome immigrants was certainly helpful. And then we're also, I think up until recently, have been the place where folks from Ohio have gone when they've left their hometown as well. So that's also helps.
Yeah, that's true. Starting to see some of those people come to Cincinnati too. Interesting. So you talked a little earlier how CMHA has gone from just shy of 2,000 units to almost 5,000. How have you managed that growth? And then I guess, because I've seen you cycle in and out of properties as well, like a traditional owner operator. How has that come about? Or you talked about how it's come about, but how is that going? How is that plan working for you?
Yes, we have a number of properties that are what we would call our workforce properties. So they're predominantly market rate units, with 30% of the units are, we cap the rents and cap the incomes of the folks who live there at more workforce level. In those properties, we treat much more like any market rate developer would. We assess them every year, and if the market's right, then maybe we sell one and buy two more. But if the market's not right, or whatever conditions are present, then we're going to hold them a little longer. We have a bunch of properties that are LIHTC properties, so those are locked into minimum 15 years of affordability requirements, and then an extra 15 through the Ohio Housing Finance Agency's restrictions they put on the property. So those are much more long-term holds, and those are much more those populations are more subsidized or more lower income folks. Part of you know part of where housing connects with other kind of pieces of the puzzle is on education and providing a stable place for a family to put their kids through school is so critical. I forget the exact stats, but the more times you switch school districts, the likelihood of your success goes down almost exponentially. And trying to make sure you hit those third grade proficiencies is critically important to a lifetime of learning and success for a student. Trying and lower income folks have traditionally been the folks who are much more destabilized in their education path, and so those keeping those affordable places to live more consistent so that folks can stay there through as their kid goes through school is critically important. So those properties that are more our LIHTC properties are we're locked in by a bunch of rules to keep them for a long period of time, but also some of our other more kind of mission related goals, we're keeping those for a lot longer. So we definitely have a mix of how we approach the real estate itself and what to do with each piece of real estate that we own.
Yeah. Are those LIHTC deals? And for those who don't know, LIHTC is low income housing tax credits, LIHTC. Are those LIHTC deals acquisition rehabs, or are you doing ground up? Are you using the 4% credits or the nines or whatever's right?
Yep. They are each of those four things. Yeah. So we've done a couple acquisition rehabs with partners or from partners. And then we've also done a bunch of new construction. So our Legacy Point project over as part of our Choice Neighborhoods grant was four, yeah, four separate LIHTC deals, two 9%, two 4%. We're working on one in East Columbus right now with our partner, Woda Cooper Companies. It's a 4% with a bunch of Recovery Act money in it. Our Harriet's Hope was a 9%. So we take whatever approach we can find. And when we talked to a lot of other for-profit developers who have a much more regional focus, they look for projects that'll score well so that they can get funded and keep producing units. And their business model is more production focused. And while ours is obviously we have our unit goal, ours we have to be within Franklin County. And so we come up with an idea or a partner or whatever and try and figure out which funding source will help us make that happen. And so is that 4% with gap financing? Is that the 9%? Does it score well enough for the 9% program? Do we need to do something completely different? So that's how we approach those.
Yeah, the LIHTC world is interesting because what has occurred to me is that the real estate is almost a secondary consideration. It's almost a consequence of the scoring and the map
Mm-hmm.
and these, I wouldn't say arcane, but these matrices that you have to put a site or a property through when you're scoring it, to your point. To is it in a qualified census tract? Is it in a difficult development area? Is it
Mm-hmm.
close to a grocery store? How much density can you get? Will the income limits support or not support the project? Because there's some sites that, like, I've got 9 acres here, but I think it's in a QCT. It might even be in a DDA, but for a 4% deal, the area median income isn't there to support it.
Mm.
So it's like,
Yep.
how, how do you do that? And
Yep.
it's a puzzle that I'm sure at some point I'll figure out, but I've got a lot of other things going. So
Yeah, it is. There are people who like I said, these larger developers we work with have just shops of people who are just census data and mapping experts that find the guidelines come out and they have the 7 census tracts in Ohio that score perfectly, and then they go out and buy property in those census tracts and we just don't have that. We don't have that breadth of area to work in. We have to say what can be done in Franklin County and what ideas are we working on where this might work. To your point, a weird quirk that happened this year was in the 9% LIHTC program is very competitive and has all the scoring criteria. And one of the biggest point scoring categories was discount to market. And so they'd establish what the market rate rent was in a census tract and then what your 60% AMI LIHTC rent was. And whatever had the biggest gap, the biggest difference scored the most points. And so that meant the census tracts in downtown Columbus, Upper Arlington, and Dublin were all scored the highest. And so those were going to be where the perfect score opportunities were. And so no one could get site controller zoning in Upper Arlington or Dublin, but they could in downtown Columbus. And there were a bunch of 9% applications in downtown Columbus this year, which doesn't seem like that would be the case, but that's where you could score the points.
Hmm. Yeah, and what's even more interesting about that is that you can have a site, and I have one I'm working on here in downtown Cincinnati. It's literally on the other side of the street from where it needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it's what is the difference? Per the
Yep.
map, there's a big difference. It's
Yep.
about 50 feet.
Got to draw the line somewhere.
Yeah.
And we've absolutely had that happen to us as well, where that or the calendar year flips over and the census tract changes from a QCT to not. And all of a sudden you can't do you thought you were going to do a 4% deal. Now you can't.
Yeah.
And so then you got to go back to the drawing board.
Maybe we're approaching an hour here, but maybe as we're wrapping up, you talked a little bit before we got on the podcast of everything that CMHA is up to. You said June's been a busy month, so perhaps you could touch on that.
Yeah, sure. One of the more recent tools we've added to our toolbox is our ability to issue our own bonds to finance our projects. So a couple years ago, we went through the process of getting a rating from Standard and Poor's. So we have an A+ rating from S&P, and that allows us access to the bond market. Excuse me. Again, all public housing authorities across Ohio and probably all of them around the country are allowed to issue their own bonds, but you need a credit rating to do it. And so we got over that first hurdle of getting the rating, and now we're almost exclusively self-financing all of our deals. So we just bought a 160 unit property May 31st, June 1st, and financed it 100% with our own bonds. So 10-year interest only tax exempt bonds. And earlier this year closed a 4% deal where we were the construction and perm lender through our bonds on the 4% deal. And the extra step of that is you have to pay for at least 50% of your project costs with tax exempt bonds to get 4% credit. So we were the construction lender, the perm lender, and the source of the 50% test for the LIHTC, kind of all wrapped into one issuance. So very much streamlined that. And then obviously makes acquisitions a lot simpler. And then for the first time, we are closing this week on a construction loan financed with our bonds to a partner developer where we're not in charge. And that's for the second phase of River and Rich, which is over in the Franklinton neighborhood of Columbus. It's on the former site of the Riverside Bradley and Sunshine Terrace public housing. So those were built right around Riverside Terrace was built right around the same time as Poindexter. So back in the 40s, and then became just obsolete. And then, so we demolished it a long time ago, and all the residents received vouchers, and the land was sitting vacant for a long time until the city or the Army Corps of Engineers put in a flood wall around that side of Franklinton, and the city got things going with the Franklinton neighborhood. So we partnered with Casto, the Robert Weiler Company, and the Kelly companies on the redevelopment of that site. So phase one's been operational for a few years, and now we're about to break ground on phase two, and we're the construction lender for the deal. So we're the landlord. We continue to own the property and lease it to the partnership. So we're the landlord, we're a member of the partnership, and we're the construction lender in the deal, all wrapped up into one. So that is closing this week. And then we have a senior project down in Grove City that will hopefully be closing either by the end of this month or very soon after. It's our first project in Grove City. So very excited to work with them. And then we got May was 9% award time. And so we received a 9% LIHTC award for our project in downtown Columbus. So we'll be working over the summer on actually when you apply, you just have the conceptual drawings and everything is in that stage. And then your final application has to be almost everything designed and all that. So now we'll be spending the summer actually figuring out how to do everything we promised to do in the application.
That's awesome. Is that going to be, I would assume it's not going to be a garden style deal in downtown.
No, it'll be so the 9% program caps your units at about 70. And so we were able to squeeze out an additional 12 market rate units on top of that and still make the deal work. So it'll be 82 units, so 5 stories with some parking.
Nice. Structured parking?
No. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Light doesn't pay for $35,000 of space structured parking.
I know. You don't think about it, but that parking is super expensive. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's 35, $40,000 a space
Yep. It
just for a
is.
car.
Yep. Yeah, trying to do any deal with affordability in it, even with all the tools we have access to. If you have to build a parking garage, we haven't
Shoots it
figured
in
it
the
out yet.
foot. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
I guess my last question is what sort of technology does CMHA utilize in the operation or acquisition of the assets that you have?
A lot of our, so I'll answer a couple of ways. So on the asset management side, I think, in the process of switching to Yardi is our big kind of property management, asset management software that is ubiquitous around the industry. Either most or all of the firms we contract with for property management use it. So integrating all that together is one step. Voucher team uses, I think, still our own proprietary kind of software for managing our vouchers, which is its own just insanely complex process. 14,600 vouchers and keeping track of all the HUD requirements for those. Those are probably the more advanced technology that we use. And then over here on my end, we just use a bunch of Excel. We're very much kind of Luddites in the technology space. We use Excel to track where we are in projects. We use Excel for modeling, and that's about it. So would love to, and talking to some other folks, they use maybe Smart Sheets, but which is basically Excel. And so a lot of them are still in that world. So I feel like we're behind the curve, but or I feel like we're significantly behind the curve. We might just be just a little bit behind the curve in terms of technology.
Yeah, commercial real estate has been historically slow to adopt and adapt to new technologies. So we'll get there eventually. But yeah, you guys are doing great. Yeah, you have a lot of other positive things going on. Cheers to you guys. That's awesome.
I appreciate it.
If somebody is in Franklin County and thinks that they have the perfect site for you or perfect property, maybe that you guys should buy, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
You can just email me. That's going to be the best way. So I don't know if you want me to say my email address. My last name's pretty long, so it might be easier to post it or something like that.
I'll
But
do that.
happy to talk to anybody. We're always open to new ideas, new partnerships. Yeah, just shoot me an email.
Bob, you're awesome. Thank you so much for your time today and hope you have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thanks. I really enjoyed it, Stash.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.